All right, what's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the Queen's Strength Conditioning Summer Digital Series Masterclass, session number 6. Today, we're going to be talking about the squat and its progressions. I guess I'll introduce myself. My name is Zach. If you guys don't know, I'm the summer strength conditioning intern. I guess let's get into it. So, if this is your first time tuning into the Strength Conditioning Masterclass, kind of the goal of this weekly series is to break down, discuss, different training principles, ideas, and methods to be able to provide you with the tools and knowledge you need to design your own training programs. And I think in terms of that, today's is a big one. The squat is such a major part of what we do in our training programs. So let's kind of get into it and we'll talk about it. So the squat, first of all, it's a functional movement. It plays a critical role in our ability to squat, plays a critical role in how well we're able to move. We see this kind of triple flexion movement and position all over sports, whether it be jumping, athletic positions, playing defense for basketball, returning a serve like a volleyball, bump, offensive lineman coming out of their stance when the play starts, different change of directions, and so on. So we want to be able to really focus on training these muscles and our ability to produce force in this position to ensure great athletic performance. So in terms of how we classify the squat in relation to other exercises, we consider it to be a knee dominant exercise because the largest point of flexion is the knee. But it's important to consider that there are definitely plenty of other factors that contribute to a safe and effective squat. So I'll be getting into those. And then finally, there are different ways that we can load this pattern in order to increase or decrease the demand and ensure that the athlete's doing the squat properly. So we can change different factors of the squat to either increase or decrease the demand depending on the athlete's needs without even really changing the exercise. So now looking at the muscles used, I kind of think this is a pretty good visual for that. I kind of like these to see which muscles are active, if any, and to which degree based on the color, the extent to which they're colored in. I just really like that to help visualize that. I'm not going to rhyme off all the different muscles used. They're listed there on the left, but this is definitely very important to consider just because the squat targets different muscles. So just different muscles. So instead of a single joint exercise where we're just kind of maybe doing a hamstring curl where we're flexing our knee and only get that hamstring on the posterior thigh, is we're able to kind of train all these different muscles at once. And we're able to get more bang for our buck metabolically that way. So there's more demand at different parts of our body. So we're burning more calories that way, training more efficiently. And it's important to consider that, different muscles have different functions in different positions. So if we want to be able to train those positions where we find ourselves in often, in a sporting scenario, we want to be able to train those muscles that way, and that way it can be more transferable into our actual competition, our actual practice, and become better athletes that way. So kind of the squat can be broken down into a couple different phases. So we'll start here with the starting position. These are all more talking about just a bilateral squat. We'll kind of talk about some more variations as we go. But in terms of the basic starting position, we kind of want to begin with our feet shoulder width apart or slightly wider than shoulder width apart. Feet should be even with each other. We don't really want a staggered stance or split stance unless that's the plan. But for a basic squat, we'll just consider our feet to be even with each other. Toes pointed slightly out. We want a neutral pelvis, so we don't want it tilted anteriorly or posteriorly. And this kind of leads into our straight spine and head position. And we want to keep a tight upper back to ensure that we have that rigidity throughout our spine and our entire upper body to be able to support whatever weight we have. Because we can really only squat as much as our upper body can support. If we have a weight on our back or a front squat and our upper body folds over, then we can't squat that way. We don't get the resistance that we want. So keeping our upper back and staying rigid the entire time will help support that weight and kind of set us up for success. Bracing is also very critical for really any exercise, but we'll talk about it obviously in a squat perspective. So here we kind of just want to create intra-abdominal pressure. So we'll start off by, we want to squeeze our glutes and engage our core. A good cue for this is you kind of want to bring our rib cage down, make sure, that our spine isn't curved, excessively or flex excessively. Bring our rib cage down, squeeze our core so that we're nice and tight. I want to take a deep breath into our midsection, almost like we're filling up a balloon. And by doing that, we kind of want to create 360 degrees of pressure within our midsection. So we don't just want our stomach to be flexed or, I guess, tense. We don't want our back. We kind of want it all the way around our core, our back, everything there. And this kind of just ensures that our torso stays upright and, enforces that rigidity that we want to keep the weight upright. So now moving into the downward movement phase, which is where we're kind of going from the top and descending into the bottom of our squat. We want to maintain a position where the back is neutral. We don't want, it to be curved over with the weight on our back kind of pushing us forward. We want our neutral spine, neutral head. And we want to allow our hips and knees to flex while keeping the torso upright. So we want our hips and knees to flex simultaneously. We like to use the term taking the elevator straight down. So that just means we're going down at the same time, like with our torso and our thigh, we kind of come down at the same time. We don't see like a hip flexion before our knee flexion on our way down. We don't see us leaning forward, bring our knees forward, but then our hips come afterwards. We kind of want them going down at the same time. And we're just going to continue this until adequate depth is reached. So that's the next slide. So we'll talk about the bottom of the squat. So here we want our feet to remain flat on the ground and kind of pressure distributed evenly between our heel, our big toe, and little toe. This is just kind of to make sure that our feet stays flat. We're not everting or inverting anyway, and kind of sets us up for solid base of support. We want our knees being driven outward, avoid them caving in. So just drive our knees outward. That way, when we move into the upper movement phase, they're not caving in. We want to maintain a neutral pelvis. We don't want it to be posteriorly tilted. We'll talk a little bit more about the bowing towards the end of the presentation, but we just want to make sure that we have our neutral pelvis. And then that leads us into our spine to be neutral, our head to be neutral as well. And we want to make sure that we have this midsection still tight. We still have tension, and we're still rigid all the way down the squat. And as we start to move into the upper movement phase, we'll exhale. And one thing to consider is that there's really no perfect depth for a squat. Every athlete's different. Every athlete has different anatomical characteristics and qualities and abilities. So we really just want to move until we can get as deep as we can, making sure that our technique stays the same and we're still squatting safely. So moving into the upward movement phase, we want to extend our knees and hips at the same rate. We took the elevator straight down, so let's take the elevator straight back up. Oftentimes we'll see, an athlete will extend at the knees and the hips will come afterwards and they kind of have almost like a jerky squat. We want to avoid that. We want them to be extending at the same rate. It just looks a lot smoother and it's more effective. And we want our feet to remain flat on the ground. So we still have that equal pressure distributed amongst our heels, big toe and little toe. We're not everting, inverting. We're not, rocking forward onto our toes. We want our feet flat and pushing throughout our entire foot. And here it's critical that we drive our knees out. So sometimes, depending on the athlete's ability, they may have the tendency for their knees to cave in and enter a valgus position. So by driving our knees out, we know we're able to stay out of that and ensure that we, get up safely. Here we're keeping the torso upright still and avoiding rounding to the back. When we're coming up, we're extending our hips and knees, but we're not extending our thoracic region. We just want to make sure that it stays straight and we have a neutral spine. And we're just going to continue to extend both the hips and the knees until that starting point again is reached. One thing to consider is we just kind of talked about all those images and just kind of in general about a bilateral squat, but doing single leg work's critically important to the development of an athlete. We do this because of something called the bilateral deficit, which basically just the force by both limbs working together is less than each independently. So the way that I kind of like to think of that is if I was to do one leg and then the sum of the weight that I can do on that leg between both legs would be greater than what I could do if I squatted with both legs at the same time. So this way we're kind of able to generate greater overall force with less overall loading. We don't have that, if we have a bar on our back, we don't have that spinal compression that would come from the weight needed to squat Bilaterally, if we have if we're going individually, obviously the resistance is less, but we're still getting greater force production, force output. Obviously, there's a greater demand here with single leg stability, and it kind of makes it a little more specific on the spectrum between, general training and sport specific training. It's kind of leaning to more sport specific. Obviously, it's not directly transferable. We're not single leg squatting during a game, but it's just being able to develop that force output while being stable on that one foot is critically important for sport performance. So here we kind of have a chart to show off the progressions of different squat variations. And we can use this chart to start with exercises where athletes can learn and master technique of squatting with safer exercises before we go up and load a ton of weight on their back where the risk increases. So if they have deficits in their movement, sometimes it's just safer to address those with other exercises that are safer. And when they're ready and can move up and perform the movement properly, we can progress them onto the next exercise down the progression. Or if they have a deficit, we can regress them and work on those inabilities and poor movement patterns on safer exercise. And that way they're able to develop that they're safer and then go forward. So the single leg pistol squat and a heel tap is a movement that we think all athletes should be able to do. Being able to stay rigid and keep your torso upright while maintaining a base of support is critical for any squat. So here we're standing with one leg on an elevated surface. We're just going to squat down on that single leg. This is chosen over traditional pistol squat with the heel tap on the elevated surface because with the contralateral leg, the traditional pistol squat with the contralateral leg extended out in front of us, just because that could promote excessive rounding of the back for the athlete, and we want to avoid that. We want to maintain the principles of a good movement pattern, ensuring that our torso is upright, midsection rigid, and we still have that 360 degrees of pressure, throughout our core. And this is an example of constraint-based training. So when we reach the ground, when that heel touches the ground, that's the depth of our squat. So, we can either raise or elevate that surface. The higher it goes, obviously, the deeper the squat. The lower it goes, the less deep the squat. So that kind of corresponds with the difficulty of the movement. So, and the contralateral foot, so that's the foot that's extended down, not on the surface. We want to make sure that that's dorsiflex. So we have our toe up. And that way, when we get down and our heel touches the ground, that's when we know to come up. We're not putting any weight on that foot. We're not using that foot to help push us up. It's just kind of there to help us guide our desired range of movement. So another one's the goblet squat. So the grip here it's called the goblet grip. So our palms are up holding the top of the dumbbell, or we can use a kettlebell to just kind of hold the weight there at our chest. You want to keep it against our chest for the entire repetition. So this is kind of a good cue because if the bottom end of the dumbbell comes off of our chest, then we know maybe our torso is not in the ideal position for, where we want it to be. We want to make sure it's kept upright. That way it touches both sides of the dumbbell. And this is just a safe way for the athlete to be able to master the movement. And we can really load this one up too. I think we have dumbbells that go up to 150 pounds in the high performance center. So we can really load this one up. And obviously if the athlete fails, they can't finish the rep, they can just drop the weight in front of them and back away. So that's kind of another one early on in the progression that we can use to help athletes master the squat pattern. So the next one is the front squat, where the barbell is loaded in front of your body with it resting on your anterior deltoid, so the front of your shoulder. There are two ways to grip the barbell, as you can kind of see in these two photos here. There's the parallel arm position, which is on the left, the guy who has his arms parallel to each other, separate from each other. Slightly wider than shoulder width with a pronated grip. And then the crossed arm position. So his arms are crossed in front of his chest and the bar rests again on his anterior deltoids, open grip with hands at the top and his fingers just kind of holding the bar in place there. The parallel arm grip requires a bit more flexibility and thoracic extension to be able to keep the bar up and your back straight that way. So athletes who may not have that ability yet can try the crossed arm grip. Or it could just be a personal preference thing, whichever the athlete likes better. What's important for this one, in both of these positions, is you want to drive those elbows up the entire time, even when, you know, we're in the downward movement phase, upward movement phase. We want our upper arms parallel to the floor for the entire rep. This is also a little safer because if we can't complete the rep, we can just drop the bar in front of us and back away. Again, we want our, you know, our center of gravity over our midfoot, knees driving forward, maintain the vertical torso. And here it's really important to take the elevator straight down. We want to focus less on sitting back and get pinned by the bar. And what's great about this is we can achieve the same demand with less weight. So if the athlete fails, they can just drop it up in front of them, but we don't have that same demand on, you know, if we're loading more weight and, you know, getting a greater demand, because we can have that same demand with less weight. So next is the back squat. So here again, there's two different positions that we can use. The high bar position, which is on the left there, the left-hand side of the screen, where the bar is above its posterior deltoid at the base of the neck, and its hand grip's only slightly wider than shoulder width. And then the low bar position, where the bar is at the middle of the trap, and the hand grip's a little bit wider than, is a little bit wider than the high bar position, so it's kind of spread out there a bit more. The high bar position can kind of place greater stress on the neck. So the low bar position is we can kind of increase our loads there, and typically we can add more resistance to a low bar squat. And here the spotter, you can kind of see in the image, just kind of stands behind the athlete. So if the athlete can't complete the rep, the spotter's there to help them bring the weight up. So now moving into some of that unilateral, the single leg work that we talked about earlier. Here we have a split squat. So here we're going to start with in the split stance. So one foot is out in front while the rear foot's extended back, kind of like that. The heel of the extended foot is raised. And we want our front knee and back knee should both be about 90-degree angles. So in this position, we're just going to squat using that one leg out in front of us. We can load this up either in that goblet position that we saw earlier with the athlete's palms up, or here we can load it with dumbbells, as kind of in this image here. Another variation of this unilateral is the rear foot elevated split squat. So just like that last one, we're in the split stance, except this time the extended back leg is elevated. So our toe can be either up like the last image, or it can be flat on the bench or a surface like this one. And this one just allows us to reach greater depth than the normal split squat would. So it kind of increases the difficulty a little bit more. So two variations that we've used, two more, are the box squat and the squat to a box. So these are examples of constraint-based training where the box shows us the depth of the squat we want to reach and kind of guides us through that desired range of motion. So they are a little bit different, even though the name's pretty similar. A box squat, we will squat down until we reach the box and come to a stop. And what this does is it kind of breaks that concentric and eccentric chain and kind of separates the two movements and allows us to work on that starting strength. So this could be valuable for someone like an offensive lineman who's coming out of that starting position, trying to be as forceful as possible. One thing to consider here is to avoid rocking and get off the box. We don't want to rock back and use our momentum to help us come up. We kind of want to just come up straight from that position there. And what's really important is we want to keep tension in our muscles when on the box. At the most, we should have 50% of our body weight resting on that box at any given time. We don't want to completely relax when sitting on that box. And then now a squat to a box is just kind of a tap and go when we reach that box height. This is kind of just used to provide a guide for a desired depth, and we're not really putting any weight on the box. We just kind of come up right as soon as we feel contact with that box at the bottom of our squat. So a common problem that we'll find with squats is our knees can kind of cave inwards. We talked about pushing our knees out throughout the squat earlier. To avoid this, we want to stay out of this valgus position. So we want to make sure that we're pushing our knees out throughout the movement. So two kind of cues that we like to use for this would be to screw our feet into the ground. So kind of grabbing the ground with our entire foot and trying to screw ourselves in. Or another one could just be to try to split the ground in half in between our feet. So this just kind of helps cue the athlete to ensure that they're having that lateral force output with their knees and making sure our knees don't cave in. This could most oftentimes be a result of poor ankle mobility. So to address this, we can just improve the athlete's ankle mobility, in dorsiflexion. So an acute fix could just be to raise those heels, increase the dorsiflexion, either using a plate underneath the heels or heel elevated Olympic lifting shoes, just kind of help increase the dorsiflexion there. So another one that we see is the inability to reach full depth. So like I said before, there's no perfect depth for an athlete. It just kind of depends on their individual anatomy and what they can do comfortably. But then at the same time is if they're only really reaching a quarter squat or a half squat, or they're really not getting down as much as they probably should. It could be a result of poor hip mobility. They don't have the ability to flex at their hips as much as you need to. Again, dorsiflexion, we can't get our knees out in front of our ankles like we'd want to, or we can increase core activation. So if our core's not activated, we're not rigid like we talked about earlier, then that weight can kind of fold us over and kind of impede our ability to reach depth. I know I mentioned this earlier, so we're going to talk about the butt wing. So this is when we're at the bottom of our squat, or kind of have a posterior pelvic tilt. And you can kind of see in that image there how he's almost rounded his lumbar spine there and his pelvis at the bottom. So a way to combat this is just to maintain tension in the muscles throughout the squat and maintain control of that pelvis. We want to be able to improve our thoracic extension ability, thoracic mobility. So this way, if we have a neutral spine, that can kind of carry down and help us control our pelvis. And also improving hip mobility can ensure that, that we're able to keep control of our pelvis in a neutral position throughout the squat. One thing that we can kind of do here is use that constraint-based training, whether it be, a squat to box where we can, guide ourselves through a range of motion where we're able to keep that pelvic control. And we can work on our hip mobility, our thoracic extension ability to help improve that. And then after a week or so, we can kind of figure out where we're at and if we can take the box away or lower the box, just to make sure that we can reach full depth without this posterior pelvic tilt occurring. So that's all I have for today. Join us next week, next Wednesday. We'll be discussing the force velocity curve and how to apply it to your workouts at home and in the gym. So thanks for watching. If there's any questions, I can answer those if you want to pop them in the chat. All right. Well, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next week.